Across Western lore, one name rises above all others in both fame and mystery. Arthur, King of the Britons. One boy would rise from the position of second son of a minor knight to become the legendary ruler of Camelot, bearer of Excalibur, and conqueror of the Saxon menace. He would become the ultimate symbol of chivalric honor and redefine the nature of his society for centuries to come. Arthur was born in a cloud of suspicion, at a time of turmoil throughout his homeland. His father, High King Uther Pendragon, fathered Arthur via magic, trickery, and lies. He assumed the identity of a political enemy and seduced that enemy's wife. A man who would go to any lengths to get what he wanted, but when he was discovered, he killed his rival and married the woman he coveted. Uther never showed much interest in the fate of his only son. Indeed, shortly after Arthur's birth, he surrendered the boy in secret to the legendary sorcerer Merlin, to be fostered under one of his own knights, one Sir Ector. Uther's fight against his enemies, the villainous Saxons, at long last ended in victory, but at the cost of his own life. This plunged what is now England and Wales further into chaos and discord, as high lords and petty kings fought for the scraps of power the evidently heirless Uther had left behind. While wars of succession fractured the land, Arthur led a life of study, training, and preparation. Sir Ector, charged by Merlin with raising the boy as his own son, saw to it that he received all the necessary education befitting the child of a respected knight and minor lord. Merlin supplemented that training with lessons in history, honor, and just rule. Though he did not yet know it, Arthur was slowly being prepared for the day when he would emerge from the shadows and take his rightful place on the throne. But time was short. The small kings that had risen up and partitioned the once great nation into smaller feudal states waged continuous war with each other, each seeking to increase his own power and glory. Fields burned, villages were abandoned, and the people suffered. At last, Merlin could not be idle any longer. Emerging from his tutorship of his ward after over a decade, he called together the men whose greed and ambition were ravaging the country he called home. It is a testament to his reputation that they heeded his call and came to hear his decree. Merlin declared to the assembled nobles that God himself had set a sword into a great stone, and any man who could draw it out would have the mandate of heaven and be the next High King. For a time, as lords and their retainers from the entire country took their turns against the sword, the cities and countryside knew peace. Many who had not come when Merlin first called nonetheless rode to test themselves against the blade, and one by one they failed. As the months and years wore on, with none succeeding in the great trial, rumors of skirmishes and small battles once again began to spread from town to town. Knowing his time was limited, and that the power of the challenge would not hold back civil war much longer, Merlin sent Arthur, now 15, with his half-brother Kay, on a seemingly innocent errand that he knew would take them past the place where sat the sword in the stone. The story that follows is known around the world. Arthur slid the sword free, and after a brief uncertainty, was declared the next High King of the Britons, a moment which would change Arthur and England forever. But it would not bring peace. Not yet. Now there were whispers of those who called him usurper to greet him. There were many who joined him, of course. Knights from across the islands flocked to his red dragon banner. Those who were tired of fighting for small men, who lacked honor and vision, came to his cause. Those who wished to re-establish the unity that had been known in former days, they came too. Others, who remembered that it was Merlin's own steady hand that had pulled them all back from the brink, cast their lot with this boy king as well. But many others refused to relinquish their crowns and the lands that they had fought so bitterly for, and instead of raising the red dragon standard, raised their own in rebellion. 11 small kings joined their forces in secret and plotted the ruin of Arthur. And then they marched. Arthur and his retinue were engaged in a tradition of new kings, touring the countryside and receiving the oaths of fealty that were owed to him by his subjects. From town to town and fort to fort, his retinue of 200 knights moved quickly across the land, not knowing their every move was watched and their every step reported. The young knights that accompanied Arthur were themselves too brash and foolish to stay their lips, and the movements of the entourage were known to the conspirators almost before they were made. Whispered messages were passed, forces were gathered at an opportune place, and at last, the inevitable ambush was sprung. A force 5 times the size of the kings marched out from the morning mist, nearly surrounding his forces as Arthur rode out from the latest village in his tour. Arthur, inexperienced in combat, foolishly engaged the army arrayed before him, and was promptly forced to retreat. The town to which he fell back was besieged. Arthur hid, paralyzed by indecision, behind the hastily assembled defenses. He hid, and he prayed, begging the god who had brought him the crown to let him survive wearing it. Whether it was the divine, or simply speedy messengers Arthur had to thank as lost to time, but Merlin, ever vigilant in his duty to the young king, appeared upon the city walls, and he hurled great gouts of fire, and called forth Arthur and his knights to the charge. They fought for hours, but when it was done, the enemy had been forced to retreat, and Arthur had learned a valuable lesson. The unsure young man, overwhelmed by the new route his life had taken, was gone, burned away under the searing heat of battle and sorcerer's fire. Arthur had watched men who had swore loyalty to him mere days before die at the hands of traitors. And now, he would gather his full forces and make those traitors pay. For long years, Arthur campaigned across the lands and islands that were his by divine right, batting aside the resistance put in his way. War had taught him the lessons of leadership well, and one by one the small lords who opposed him fell before his swelling ranks. At times, Arthur went out with his full armies and put down rebellions quickly, effectively, and justly. Other times, he went with only the best of his men and slaughtered giants, water beasts, and other worldly creatures. Any who threatened the peace of his lands, whether they be of this world or the other, were destroyed. It is even whispered among the bards and small folk that he rode his host into the other world itself to free innocents taken from their homes, a feat that would impress even his mystical tutor. But the wars went on, until the strength of his enemies began to falter at last. In the final battle, when all that remained of his foes gathered their strength for a last attempt to dethrone him, Arthur and his knights, now battle-hardened veterans, cut them down like so many before. They killed the leaders and dispersed their soldiers into the wild north. But peace came at a dire price. Arthur's mythic sword was broken in mortal combat beneath the hammer of his final enemy. However, it had served its purpose. Arthur was at last safe upon his throne, but without his weapon, he had lost one of his most potent symbols of divine authority. Once again, it would be Merlin who came to the aid of his king. On a moonless night, the two stole out from the war camp, paddling out into a nearby lake, whose location, like so many other details of his life, is unremembered. From the midnight mists rose a creature more beautiful than any Arthur had seen before, Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. Wordlessly presented Arthur with a great blade, the legendary Excalibur. Greater, even, than the sword in the stone, it could hew through iron and bone alike, and its scabbard protected any who wore it from being struck down in battle. Arthur, new blade in hand, returned to the camp at the break of dawn and declared that here he would build his capital, a new seat of power for a newly unified kingdom. Camelot. As construction began, the king put out the call. Any knight of honor and renown was welcome to take their seat at the massive round table set in Camelot's great hall. Men of action and honor heeded the summons, and one by one, legendary warriors whose fame would only grow from that day forth rode through Camelot's gates. Their names would become known for the wondrous deeds and triumphs throughout the coming years. Kay, Arthur's own half-brother, Percival, Geraint, Gawain, Bedivere, and last, but greatest of all, Lancelot du Lac. These are but a few. Camelot would go on to see hundreds of other great heroes, and a few villains under its mighty towers. Arthur had secured his peace. Now he turned his attention to securing his legacy. He had had many romantic affairs during his campaigns, with women from across the realm who sought to gain the young man's notice. Few succeeded, and none lasted long. But, in his travels, tales of one woman's beauty and grace had repeatedly met his ears. From castles to common halls alike, the people told stories of Guinevere and her many charms. It was said that she was descended from old Roman nobility, and was thus of sufficient social stature for Arthur to seek her out. Merlin was the sole voice of dissent, warning that this woman would bring Arthur and his great kingdom to ruin. But even his most trusted advisor could not stay the passions of the young king. The evening watchmen often witnessed Arthur stealing across the courtyards and walkways towards Guinevere's chambers, though they knew better than to tell of it to any who asked. The romance that passed between Arthur and Guinevere will never be known to us, but in short order they were engaged, and there was much rejoicing at word of the king having found at last a worthy bride. In these years, England knew peace. Whenever trouble arose, the knights of the Round Table rode forth and put it down before the dark tendrils of corruption and strife could take root. And all they did in the name of their great king. At Camelot, Lancelot, Arthur, and Guinevere developed a bond of friendship deeper than any of them had experienced before. The three could often be seen strolling the grounds, deep in discussion about matters from the rule of the realm to the latest antics of the court's jesters. But whenever the need was greatest, and the forces of the king absolutely had to win, Lancelot would mount his horse, and beneath the dragon banner, return justice and peace to whatever place needed it. It was one such occasion, a day which gave no sign of being different from all others like it, that Lancelot rode from the capital, and did not return. Over the weeks, months, and years to come, the hope of the royal couple to see their friend diminished to the barest ember, until at last even that went out, and Lancelot du Lac, first knight of the Round Table, was given up for dead. But their grief could not last long. From the eastern shore came the two words Arthur long dreaded to hear: Saxon invasion. The villains who had killed his father had returned, and with his greatest knight lost to him, Arthur himself must rise to meet them and drive them back into the seas. Gathering his armies in the largest force he had ever amassed, they marched across rivers, in forests, and in cities across the east. Battalions of men led by the king himself met the Saxons in bloody combat. The long peace of the king had given way, once again, to the drums of war. Skirmishes too numerous to count, and 12 great battles saw the enemy driven away from the heart of his empire. At long last, with their backs against the shore, the Saxon forces braced themselves for a last stand, and Arthur himself led the charge that drove them into the waves. As the marching drums were silenced, and standards of battle lowered, he surveyed the field. His enemies' bodies were scattered about, but so too were the remains of many men that he had called friends. Warriors who had lived their life in service to the realm had once again died for it. And for the first time in many years, Arthur felt the weight of his crown. The return to Camelot was quick, and ever the dutiful king, Arthur set about filling the empty chairs in his hall. Many new knights joined the Round Table, but one rises above all others in both importance and infamy. Mordred, a young man not yet in his 20s, was waiting for Arthur upon his return, and when at last granted an audience with the king, revealed himself to be Arthur's illegitimate son, the result of a long-forgotten affair before his marriage to Guinevere. None in the court that day could deny the resemblance between the two men, and in his heart, Arthur knew the boy to be telling the truth. Sensing the king's need, Mordred asked him for only one thing as repayment for all his years of fatherless struggle: to be knighted and seated at the Round Table alongside Arthur. Perhaps it was guilt at being absent from his child's life, or maybe it was a decision of necessity, but he granted this request, and Mordred took his place at his father's side. In the course of time, England rebuilt from the darkness of invasion, and life at Camelot began to take on the joyful tenor of its former days. At court, Arthur began to put the affairs of his realm in order, and one by one addressed the concerns of the small folk who came before him, until at last, two ragged figures, thin and careworn, were all that was left before him, and upon greeting the elder of the two, Arthur saw the face of a ghost. Lancelot du Lac had returned at last. And more, he had brought his own newly discovered son, Galahad, who was a knight in his own right, with him. As Guinevere wept openly, the king walked from his throne and embraced his brother, and the celebration at Camelot that evening was one for the ages. Arthur was now at the very height of his power and glory. His kingdom prospered. The dragon banner marched ever outward, adding new lands and peoples to its dominion. The capital's coffers filled, and Galahad took a place at the Round Table. It was of course then that Providence stepped in. A sign of the Grail, lost relic of Christendom, appeared shimmering before them all. The time for the greatest of all quests had come, and the voice of the divine demanded that the Grail be returned to Christian hands. But Arthur was tired. War had taken its toll, and the king knew that this quest was for his champions, not himself. Thus he dispatched his greatest knights to find the Grail. Many died, others came back gravely injured and never truly recovered. Others simply vanished, and nothing was ever heard of them again. The knights' numbers dwindled, and the graveyard filled. And still there was no hint that the Holy Cup would ever be found. Until at last, a lone battered knight, with chipped and dented armor, staggered into the king's hall, announcing, for all to hear, that Lancelot's own son, Galahad, had held the Grail in his mortal hands. In Arthur's name, he had taken it to a holy city in the east, that it might be safe. Galahad would never return, and Lancelot would never see his child again. The court would return to its normal affairs, but Galahad's seat at the Round Table would remain empty, as a remembrance. With the affair of the Grail settled, and the divine fervor that had gripped the court receding, Arthur's son Mordred approached his father for an audience. Mordred had seen Guinevere and Lancelot. He had seen them embrace as lovers. The two people Arthur trusted most had broken his confidence. Mordred offered to deliver the king's justice, perhaps as an attempt to increase his own stature among his fellow knights. Arthur had known they were carrying on an affair, of course. One does not remain king long by being blind to the doings of those closest to him. But now, Mordred knew, and Mordred's knowledge forced his hand. He ordered his son to arrest them both and deliver them for trial, quickly and quietly. It's possible that Arthur hoped his son's inexperience would get him killed, and things could go back to the way they were. Or maybe he sincerely hoped Mordred would succeed. The mind of a king is, after all, a secretive thing. Though he was indeed inexperienced, Mordred knew enough not to attempt this task alone. He took several knights with him and set a trap for the guilty couple. Guinevere was captured easily, but the great Lancelot quickly slipped through the clumsy trap set for him and fled. In Camelot, the king was seen to be weeping as he was forced to sentence his wife, and great love, to death by fire. Perhaps it was to spare her the agony of a long wait that he ordered the pyre be built right then and there. As tears flowed freely from the eyes of the king, and the torch approached the kindling, the doors to the great hall slammed against the walls, and before any inside had time to react, Lancelot rode through the hall, scooped up Guinevere, and retreated out the city gates. Traitorous knights, loyal to Lancelot alone, prevented pursuit until they too fled. Fury boiled in Arthur's blood. The king that had so long ruled with a cool and even hand, for the first time in his life turned his mind towards vengeance. Banners were called up, battalions raised, provisions gathered, and an army set out from Camelot. Lancelot wasn't hard to find. He only had the one castle after all. So when Arthur laid siege to it, Lancelot was caught without sufficient supplies to wait it out. He surrendered before the year was out. Arthur, remembering the years of happiness these people had brought him, decreed that Lancelot would be allowed to return to his native France as an exile, and Guinevere would be returned to the king. This mercy, however, would be short-lived. When the traitor had boarded his ship, and Guinevere at last came to Arthur's tent, his wife, who he had loved above all else in this world, would never love him again. Lancelot was the only man she cared for, and she was not going to apologize for her actions. Arthur's howl of rage could be heard across the camp, and few then were surprised when he ordered the ships of his realm to pursue Lancelot to France. And pursue he did, determined to force the man he had thought of as a brother to endure as much of the same pain as he felt now. But the dark tree of betrayal bears many fruits, and in Camelot, Mordred wanted a taste. Persuading the remaining lords that the king was mad with grief, and that the invasion of France would be a folly none of them could afford, he seized the throne for himself, and declared that he, Mordred, was the new rightful king. Arthur had barely arrived in France when word came that his empire was crumbling behind him. Coming to his senses, he knew that he could not fight two wars at the same time. Turning his fleet around, they sailed for Camelot. The battle that followed rings through the pages of myth and history alike. Many of the greatest heroes to ever walk the earth were lost, casualties mounted on both sides, and Camelot was laid waste. The king and his finest knights cut through swarms of enemies, and scoured the fields of battle searching for the traitor, until at last Arthur found him. Arthur, however, was exhausted, scabbard abandoned, armor dented and broken. Mordred had only just recently joined the fighting and was fully armed and fresh. They clashed in furious combat. Rage strengthened Arthur, and fear strengthened Mordred. In desperation, Mordred lunged with his spear and lowered his guard just as Arthur went for the killing blow. Both felt the warmth of blood on their skin, and both fell. And the High King of the Britons was dying. Mordred was dead, his forces scattered. The red dragon once again flew over the king's hall, but word soon flew through the ranks of the loyal that the king was gravely wounded. Alone, Sir Bedivere marched through the crowds, gently cradling the king's mighty blade Excalibur, carrying it down towards the lake from whence it came. He paused for a moment, drew back, and hurled the blade as far out into the water as he could. And then he wept. And all knew then that it was true. Arthur was dead. The mists of time has slipped over the events that follow. Some say 3 fairy women emerged from the sunset and retrieved Arthur's body. Others say Morgan le Fay carried him off to the mystical island of Avalon to be healed, only to return in England's hour of most dire need. Still others say that he was buried in Wales, or deposited in a cave. What became of Camelot and the Round Table is lost to us. The knights who dwelt there faded to legends. Arthur's tale is spread across the ages. His name and deeds are known around the world. But whenever danger threatens his ancient home, the eyes of the people look to the west, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Dragon King.